Hi class, in this video we are starting our discussion of prejudice. And the first thing I want to do is define that. Prejudice is a negative attitude towards all members of a distinguishable group based solely on their membership in that group. Because it is an attitude, that means that prejudice is partly cognitive, it's partly emotional, and it's partly behavioral. So my first question for you is it possible to be free from prejudice? No, you can't. Everyone has prejudice in them. Different types potentially, but it is there. So it's basically evolutionary. You have this innate ability to be prejudiced. Because everyone has it, you see it in all cultures, we know that it's something that you are born to do. That means that there's an evolutionary basis for it. So what do you think is an evolutionary benefit of prejudice? So before I give you a couple ideas, remember when we talk about evolutionary psychology, this is in us because it helped our ancestors back in the day. That does not mean you are saying it is a good thing. That does not mean you're saying this is something we need today. Just because it helped our ancestors doesn't mean it's something that's essential for us. So for example, back in the day, hunter-gatherer time, our ancestors lived in small groups that were really separated. No airplanes to fly big distances. If a stranger came to town, the person that was automatically weary of that stranger was probably more likely to survive because you don't know if that stranger is going to hurt you or harm you. And so we developed this automatic weariness of people who were different. And so that is that basis for prejudice. Again, we are a significantly more diverse world with globalization. You are always around people who your ancestors would have seen as different. There is no reason to automatically be wary of them, but it's something that is still in us because of our ancestors. And so because this is something that is evolutionary and it's not something you can just have disappear, it's going to stay in our genes and get passed down for a while longer still. That means that people now are just as prejudiced as people in the 1980s, the 1960s, the 1860s. It might appear slightly differently, but we still have the same inclination to prejudice as people in times that we tend to think of as more prejudiced times. It just appears in different ways. So for example, one way to look at prejudice in the US is to look at the number of hate groups and what type of hate groups we have. So for example, the Southern Poverty Law Center keeps track of hate groups in the US. It's a great organization. And in the US in 2021, there were 733 hate groups, which is actually a decrease from the peak in 2018. In 2018, there were 1,020 hate groups in the US. So it has gone down slightly. However, different types of hate groups have increased, some have decreased. So for example, the KKK has seen a sharp drop in the number of groups it has in the US. In 2016, there were 130 KKK groups in the US. In 2021, there were only 18. Now you can look at that significant drop and say, look, people are less racist, there's less KKK groups. No, that's not actually accurate. because the number of white nationalist groups has increased from, in 2016, it was 60 or 85. It peaked in 2019 at 155, and now it's down to, in 2021, the last year the SPLC reported, it was down to 98, which is still higher than 2016. So people are more hesitant to overtly identify as part of the Klan, but they're still willing to join a hate group based on race, white nationalism. You've also seen, depending on, there's lots of different types of hate groups. For example, anti-Semitic hate groups. In 2016, there were no anti-Semitic hate groups in the US. In 2021, there were 61. So certain types of hate have significantly increased, others have decreased, but there's always some form of hate, some form of prejudice that is visible in the US. So we like to think of ourselves as less prejudiced than people back in the day. For example, when Obama was elected, people said, we are now post-racial, we can't be racist, we can't have that kind of prejudice if we have a black president. But his election is when you saw a significant spike in hate groups. It was through his presidency that you saw the spike in the number, and it actually even kept increasing. So it increased threefold after his election and then continued to increase after Trump was elected as well. So the peak of hate groups, especially ones based on race, like white nationalism, was in the middle of Trump's presidency. And now it is decreasing again. So we're always going to have prejudice. But let's look at these three components to see what exactly it is, and then we'll get into the ways to potentially decrease it towards the end of this chapter as well. When, again, remember, it's cognitive, it's emotional, it's behavioral. For the cognitive component, you have categorization. Basically, we like to group people into categories. So categorization is this grouping of objects or people by key characteristics. And this is really fundamental to cognition, this categorization. When it comes to this class, we focus on social categorization, putting you into groups with other people that we have decided are like you. And so this is, if you look at infant research, newborns show some categorization. They prefer human faces to non-human faces. So even from birth, you categorize, is this a human like me? Is this not a human? However, other forms of categorization, they don't show a preference. For example, newborns show no preference for faces based on race. So a white newborn is not going to prefer a white face to a black face. It's all human face is all they care about. However, that can change quickly. If a newborn lives in a monoracial community, neighborhood, so they only see one type of face. If they are white and all their neighbors are white, if they are black and all their neighbors are black, then by 3 months of age, they will show a preference for their own race. They will develop that category, white, black, Asian, just by 3 months of age. However, if they are not raised in a monoracial community, if their neighborhood has a lot of people of 2 or more races, they don't develop that preference. That is something that the environment has to teach them, even if it is not explicitly taught, because you're not sitting your 2-month-old down to say, here's who we like. But if they pick it up from their environment, what faces do I see? What faces do I not see? And by 3 months old, that category is built in. So we're not hardwired to categorize people based on race. We're just hardwired to categorize people like us, not like us. And who you see in your environment teaches you from birth who you're supposed to consider like us. It's this fundamental category of the us versus them. And from an early age is when you add in these observable categories, things like gender, age, race. You have to be, even ones that are less observable, you can be taught. So things like religion, things like sexual orientation, the number of anti-LGBTQ plus hate groups in the US increased, especially after same-sex marriage was legalized at the federal level. That is something you have to be taught if you are going to dislike someone for something that is less overtly obvious, like their religion, their political ideology, their sexual orientation. And even if you, so again, from birth, there's the human, non-human. By like 3 months, you can be taught things that are easy to detect, like race. Categorization does not automatically generate prejudice, but categorization is that first step to create prejudice. Once you categorize people, then you often put labels on that group to sum up, okay, I'm putting you in this group. This is what being in that group means. If you're in this group, this is what you are like. And so that's where you can get to a stereotype. A stereotype is the belief that a particular attribute is characteristic of the group as a whole, regardless of the actual variation among the group's members. Stereotype was a term created by Walter Lippmann, and the basic idea is that we're cognitive misers, which is something we have talked about before in chapter 2. And so we like to rapidly categorize other people according to what we think of as normal, typical, or abnormal. And then we develop really, if we know someone, if it is our own group we have a lot of experience with, we will develop really accurate narratives, really complex, diverse narratives for our own group. People in your own group can be different from each other. They're not all the same. But when it's another group, the them, then we tend to have very simple, sketchy ideas about who they are. So that's stereotypes. Question for you. Generally speaking, are stereotypes accurate? Yes. Generally speaking, stereotypes are often accurate. They're heuristics. They are a shorthand way of dealing with complex things. Stereotypes tend to overall be accurate. However, that does not mean that they are good. It doesn't mean we should keep stereotypes around, because even though they tend to be accurate, they tend to be incomplete. They don't talk about the underlying reasons why those observed differences tend to be true. A couple of examples of that. One stereotype is that men are better at math than women. That is an accurate stereotype. If you look at math scores senior year of high school, men are more likely to be in the advanced math classes and they score higher, generally speaking. However, just because that stereotype is true doesn't mean it's a beneficial one. Because early on in education, like in elementary school, there is no difference in math. There is no genetic reason men are better at math. It is the environment that tells women, you're not supposed to be good at this. I remember when I was in high school and I was in AP Physics, and I was the top student in AP Physics. And I was a woman in a class where women aren't supposed to be good, and I was in a high school that had very strong stereotypes about what women should do and what men should do. And the other students in the class would regularly express shock at how I was doing better on tests, how I was doing better in the class. I was getting the message very overtly, you're not supposed to be good at this. This is not supposed to be your thing because you are a woman. And so I was stubborn. I kept with it. I stayed at the top. But if you hear this message all through school, women are going to stop taking the math classes. They're going to stop raising their hand to answer. And so they're going to do worse at the end, not because there's any legitimate reason for them to be doing worse, but because their environment told them this is what you're supposed to do. The stereotype basically makes itself true. Another example, if you are Black, you're more likely to get arrested. That's true. If you look at who gets arrested, if you look at who gets sent to prison in our country, it's significantly more likely to happen to you if you are Black. That, again, just like with math and gender, there is no innate reason for this to be true. And if all you do is say, I assumed this person was a criminal because they were Black, you are helping to create that stereotype to be true. Because it has to do with, and we'll talk about this later in this chapter, it has to do with the racism in our criminal justice system, where every step along the way, you get treated differently if you are a person of color. And so it makes it more likely the cops stop you. It makes it more likely they arrest you. It makes it more likely you go to trial. It makes it more likely you get convicted and that you get a jail sentence. And so, yes, it's true, you're more likely to be in the system, but it's because of how the system was set up that makes that stereotype accurate. So just because they're accurate doesn't mean we should go along with them. It doesn't mean we should make decisions based on them, because it's not talking about the why is this accurate. And it's unfair to the specific individual just because they're in this big group. Experiments tend to show that once we have a clear and specific idea about a particular person, a given individual, it's easier for us to abandon stereotypes that guide us before we really know the person. But we're still not willing to give up that general stereotype. We just find the exceptions to the stereotype. When we don't know a lot about a person, the stereotype about their group really influences how we treat them, what we assume about them. And the problem is, besides you don't know the basis for the stereotype, is that if the stereotype is inaccurate for that person, it can cause problems. It can be detrimental to that individual. So a couple of experiments. Stone's experiment, they had participants listen to a 20-minute recording of a college basketball game. And they were told to focus on the player that was named Mark Flick. And they were given a folder about Mark Flick. Half of the folders, so half of the participants got a folder with a picture of a Black man. Half of the participants got a folder with a picture of a white man. Because again, they were listening to a recording. They weren't watching a video of the game. After the game, they were asked to rate the performance of Mark Flick. If they got a folder that had a picture of a Black man, if they thought Mark Flick was Black, they rated him as having more natural athletic ability, and they rated him as having played a better game than the participants who got the folder with a picture of a white Mark Flick. If they thought Mark Flick was white, they rated him as having greater hustle and greater basketball smarts than the participants who got the picture of a Black Mark Flick. Because the stereotype that if you're Black, you have natural athletic ability. They assumed if they thought the player was Black, he's just naturally good at basketball. If they thought he was white and he did well in the game, it's because he had such amazing hustle. For the Duncan experiment, They saw a film of a black man and a white man arguing, and then one of them gets shoved. And so half of the participants saw the white man shove the black man. Half of the participants saw a version where the black man shoved the white man. If it was the black man who did the shoving, the participants were more likely to rate it as an aggressive act. If it was the white man who did the shoving, they were more likely to see it as playful and not aggressive. Again, you have the stereotype that black men are more violent, more aggressive than white men. And so this can lead, if you're seeing this just out on the street corner and you see this interaction, is it playful, something you can ignore? Is it aggressive, something that needs a call to the cops, something that needs a response? And this bias in the Duncan experiment was found even with black participants. And as we'll get into later, you can be biased, you can hold these stereotypes even against groups that you are a part of. So a couple of questions for you. Who is more empathic, men or women? Next question, who is more talkative, men or women? There are no differences, no gender differences based on these two things. The sexes don't differ in their ability to feel or express empathy for other people. And both men and women say on average about 16,000 words a day. There are no gender differences, but we have these assumptions. These connect with what Glock and Fisk call hostile sexism or benevolent sexism. Hostile sexism is when you hold a negative stereotype, often about women. So this is when you think women are inferior to men because they're less competent, less intelligent, less brave, less capable. For example, the idea women aren't as good at math, that is going to be hostile sexism. Benevolent sexism is when you think women are better in certain areas. Women are more kind, more empathic, more nurturing. And even though that might sound good, you think women are, more nurturing. How's that bad? It's bad because even that form sees women as the weaker sex. Even the benevolent kind can be patronizing. For example, during the early days of COVID, or even not just COVID, but that's when it was really heightened. And all the schools shut down, daycare shut down, all these kids are home. Which parent, if it was a heterosexual couple, which parent was stuck being in charge of that childcare? Which parent had to stay home to help with the virtual schooling? If the daycare was closed because of a COVID case. In the vast majority of those heterosexual couples, it was the woman. You're more nurturing, you're in charge of the kids. Too bad if it's going to affect your career. I'm the man, I'm not supposed to be in charge of this. That is how even good forms of sexism, this benevolent sexism, can hurt women. Is still bad, even if you think you're trying to imply something nice. For an experiment done by Qizhu Zhang's research group, what they found was that so hurricanes have either male or female names. They mix it up. They found that people were more than twice as likely to die in hurricanes that were named after women versus hurricanes that were named after men. They looked at deaths between 1950 and 2012. And so they thought, does this mean that people take female named hurricanes less seriously? Women aren't as strong as men, so a female named hurricane can't be as bad as a male named one. Now, this was just a correlational study. And remember, correlation does not equal causation. Just because they saw this relationship between deaths and the name, because they did a correlation, they could not imply causation, that it was the name that caused people to take the hurricane less seriously and thus be more likely to be killed. Also, another problem with this was that all hurricanes had female names before 1979. And so for the first almost 30 years that they used in the study, there were no male names that they could use to compare. And then finally, most of the data that they used came from a small number of very deadly storms. So a lot of hurricanes don't kill people, and then some can kill a ton of people. Think about Hurricane Katrina that killed thousands. That sort of skews the data. And so in order to do this and show that it actually was the sexism that contributed, they had to do an experiment. And so what they did was they gave participants the names of some hurricanes. So here's a picture of it. How many people do you, or how likely are you to evacuate is what they say. How likely are you to evacuate? And how intense do you think the storm is going to be? How bad do you think it's going to be for our county? Are you going to leave? Half the time it was a male name, half the time it was a female name. They rated the male names as more intense and said they'd be more likely to evacuate than the storms with female names. So yes, part of the reason more people die in female named storms is because it's a lady storm. Because of the sexism, they assume it's not going to be so bad. And so the next thing I'm going to talk about, the final thing I'll talk about in this video, is the emotional component of prejudice. And then in the next video, we'll start with the behavioral component. The emotional roots of prejudice often result in stereotypes and attributions that are mutually contradictory. It's emotional, it doesn't necessarily make sense. Partly this is because stereotypes have two distinct purposes. One, like we talked about before with being cognitive misers, it provides energy-saving informational shortcuts, but also stereotypes provide us rationalization after the fact for our prejudice feeling. We want to have this prejudice, and so we find a way to back it up, even if it's not logical. So for an experiment that Phelps did connected with this, participants were shown pictures of white and black faces while their brains were being scanned. They were doing an fMRI. And what they found, they did it two different ways. Half of the time, they were just shown the pictures and looked to see what happened for their brain. Half of the time, they were told that this was a visual test. And so they were not seeing the faces as faces, but as part of this larger test. If they were just shown the faces, and so they were actually focusing, this is a face of this person, the amygdala became more active when they saw a picture of the outgroup. So when the white participants saw a black face, or when the black participants saw a white face, the part of their brain that's responsible for strong emotions, especially fear, lit up. There is an emotional component to this outgroup categorization, the them. When they thought this was just a visual test, so they weren't focusing, this is a person, it's part of this test, then the amygdala did not light up. There wasn't that emotional component. So the brain is designed to register differences, but the negative, the emotional associations that we can connect with those differences, that is based on learning and also the context that we are in. And so that is where I will stop for this video. We'll start with the behavioral component in the next one.